My name is John Cornicello, and I'm here to help you learn about and understand studio lighting. Today my topic is soft light. How do you define soft light? What are the qualities of light? What makes a light soft? The two main considerations in describing hard or soft lighting are the shadow edge transitions and the contrast. So let's start with contrast, how light or dark the shadows are. The contrast of the scene is controlled by the environment and how diffuse the light source is. First, let's define diffusion. Diffusion is the spreading out of something more widely. Too many photographers think of diffusion as a way to soften the light. That is a strong misconception that I will try to get back to in a minute. Putting diffusion on a light spreads the photons out in a wider pattern and homogenizes the light. If you look at the shadow cast by something lit with a small open reflector like the standard 7-inch dish, you can sometimes see two edges to the shadow. This happens because the reflector around the light bulb is less efficient than, not as bright as, the light bulb, and both the bulb and the reflector cast concentric shadows. Diffusion over the small reflector will homogenize it to one shadow. It will also send out the photons in a wider pattern, which may allow them to bounce off the surroundings such as the walls, the ceilings, and the floor. If those surfaces are white or light in tone, the shadows open up and become brighter, less contrasty. And some people will perceive the lighter toned shadows as being softer. But are they? Before we tackle that, more about the environment. If the walls are painted some other color, your diffused light will bounce around and pick up a color cast. If the walls are dark, or if you surround your subject with black foam core V-flats or other black panels, you get what some would call negative fill. That makes the shadows darker and the scene more contrasty. The confusing part of this is that as long as the light stays the same size in relationship to the subject, the diffusion only affects the contrast, that is the tone of the shadows. The shadow edge transition stays the same. So again, I ask, does a lighter toned shadow mean a softer light? Let's look at what happens when we put diffusion over the light. Here our lovely model, who graciously maintains the same pose and expression for us, is lit by a 7-inch metal dish reflector placed about 30 inches away. Pay attention to the nose shadow. Notice how dark it is and how quickly it transitions from dark to light. Definitely a hard light. When I add a sheet of diffusion material over the light, you will see that little, if anything, changes on the face of the subject. The shadow is still dark and still has a hard edge. What you cannot see is that the light got dimmer, so I had to raise the power of the light to maintain the same exposure. So some might mistakenly say that the light is less intense and thereby softer. But there is no visual change to the shadow edge. It is not any softer in terms of quality. But when I add a white reflector on the opposite side from the light, we see a big difference. I have now modified the environment. I'm giving the light something to bounce off and fill in the shadows, making it lighter in tone. But look at the edge transition. It is still the same hard edge shadow. Is this soft light? So let's look at that shadow edge transition. It's sometimes referred to as the penumbra. That is the width of the gradient between the darkest part of the cast shadow and the diffuse highlight or true tone of the subject. In portraits, the most obvious cast shadow is that of the nose onto the face. Where that shadow falls is determined by the position of the light as described by the standard lighting patterns. You have split, Rembrandt, loop, and beauty. Those are the topic for another discussion. Right now we aren't looking at where the shadow falls, but what the shadow looks like. Does it have a hard defined edge, or does it gradually fade from dark to light? A hard light source causes a hard edge shadow with a crisp, well-defined edge, while a soft light source causes a gradient shadow edge. That shadow transition is controlled by the size of the light as seen by the subject or in relation to the subject. A light that is close to the subject is relatively larger than that very same light if it's backed away from the subject. You've probably heard it 100 times. The closer the light, the softer the light. At first this may sound backwards. A light in close is brighter and stronger than the same light far away, but that is intensity, and that can be controlled by changing our exposure. Don't confuse the brightness or intensity of a light with its quality or softness. When the light is in close, it is larger and thereby provides photons that illuminate the subject from a wider surface area. It is as if the light wraps around the subject, although we know that light travels in straight lines. Think of a sunny day. The sun is gigantic, but is so far away that it appears to us as a small light source casting hard-edged shadows. When a cloud passes between the sun and the earth, the cloud is lit by the sun and it is much closer to us and becomes the light source, a relatively much larger one, and the shadows cast have a much softer transition. On an overcast day, the light comes from many more directions and the shadows go away. With photographic lighting, we have the original lighting instrument as our sun. If we want the softer light than that, we turn to various modifiers that make the light larger. These can be softboxes, umbrellas, octoboxes, and the like. Now I am changing from the small dish reflector to a 24 by 36 inch softbox at the same 30-inch distance from the face. Notice that the shadow edge has become much less defined as light strikes the face from more angles and directions, creating its own fill light to soften the transition. When I place the white foam core reflector now, the shadow is almost completely gone with its wide transition and lower density. Here we have a soft light. Now you might point out that the softbox does have a diffuser, and most actually have two. So is the diffusion that is softening? No. The internal diffuser is there to spread the light evenly to fill the outer panel, which then becomes your large light source. It is the size of this panel that determines the shadow edge. The diffusion mirror material provides an even coverage across the face of the softbox, but it is the fact that the light is now much larger in size that softens the shadow edge. Here is what I want you to take away from this. Contrast is controlled by the environment, and shadow edge quality is controlled by the size of the light. Diffusion on its own that is the same size as the light it is covering does not change the quality or softness of the light. It spreads the light out into a wider pattern, which then might allow it to bounce off the environmental surfaces, which will then brighten the shadows. But the shadow edge remains the same size if the light source does not change size. Adding an additional layer of diffusion over a light may help even the light across the subject if the original diffusion is thin and you can see the hot spot through it. But after that, multiple layers of diffusion only lower the output of the light. You may want that if you're trying to shoot at a large, wide open aperture, or you might not want that if you're running low on battery power. To soften the shadow edge, you have to make the light larger in relation to the subject. This is why we have modifiers in so many different sizes. I didn't talk about it here, but you usually do not want to move the light closer or further away to control its size, as that also affects the light relationship between the subject and the background. You want to pick the light to subject distance that sets the relationship you want, and then pick the modifier size that gives you the shadow edge quality you want. You can find more information like this in my book, Anatomy of a Studio Portrait, which is available as a printed book or as a digital edition. Go to cornicello.com/portrait-book for more information. I would also like to thank Interfit Photographic for the use of their lights and lighting modifiers. You can get a 10% discount on Interfit products purchased directly from them at interfitphoto.com by using the code Cornicello10 at checkout. Till next time, this is John Cornicello, and I encourage you to go out and light up your world. Thank you.